My name is Csaba Csere, and I used to be editor-in-chief of Car and Driver magazine. My good friend Dave Vanderwerp, who is also a co-worker at Car and Driver, asked me to say a few things about the Acura NSX. I did the first drive of the NSX for Car and Driver, and it was in this issue, September 1989. It involved flying to Honda's test track at Tochigi, which is outside of Utsunomiya. And it was really a great experience because all the key engineers were on hand and they could tell us everything about the car. And I'm sure you guys know more about the car than I do, but I remember a few key details. They really wanted this car to have a great feeling of control that it gave the driver, wanted the car to have great feedback. And to that end, they did a number of things. They made the car very light, all aluminum body, aluminum suspension. That was all very well done. But they did a couple of other unusual things too. For example, they didn't want power steering because they wanted that direct feel of manual steering. Well, that was pretty unusual in a supercar like that. And they had to do a number of things to make it work. For example, they used pretty small tire and wheel sizes. They wanted a small contact patch because the smaller the contact patch was, the less steering effort was required. Of course, when you use a small contact patch, you end up giving up some grip, so they went with very sticky rubber. And that seemed like a good solution at the time. Unfortunately, when the tires started wearing out at 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 miles, some of the owners didn't really appreciate that. I'm thinking that Honda might have been swayed here by its motorcycle routes, where it's pretty common for high-performance motorcycles to go through rear tires in 4,000 miles. I know, I've got a couple of them myself, but it really didn't work in the car world. Another aspect of the car to make the manual steering possible was the car had iron brake calipers. And at the time, and for years before, a lot of the exotic car makers, even Porsche on the 911 on the more expensive cars, had aluminum brake calipers because they were lighter. But Honda couldn't do that because they had a pretty small wheel, and they also wanted to position the steering geometry so they had minimal scrub radius. They wanted that steering axis to intersect the ground right in the center of the contact patch because that would reduce steering effort. And in order to do that, they didn't have a lot of room for a brake caliper. They wanted to package the biggest possible rotor, and in order to make a caliper rigid enough to fit in this tight package, they had to make it out of iron instead of aluminum. And those are some of the interesting details that the Honda guys did with this car in order to make it manual steering and give it that feel that we all liked. The other thing that always struck me about the NSX was how good the seats were. The seats did not have a lot of adjustment. As I recall, they just went fore and aft and they reclined. But they had great lateral support. And in fact, the lateral support wasn't down here on your waist. It was up by your shoulders, which is really where you need it. Because when you're going around a corner, your butt is already planted in the seat. It's the top of your body that wants to move around. And they had this great lateral support up here. And they came up with some really good contouring because it was good lateral support for a reasonably thin guy like me, but it seemed to fit bigger guys well too. I've often said to people at other car companies that if you want to build a good sports car seat, just go copy that original 1990 NSX seat. It's rarely been equaled. Well, once we got NSXs in the States, we of course road tested them, but then the key thing was to put an NSX in a comparison test. And we did that for the first time in this issue, September 1990. And the test was called the Errata cars, lust at first sight, because it was all the cars we loved. Acura NSX, the Chevy Corvette ZR1, Porsche 911, Lotus Esprit Turbo, and the Ferrari 348. It was a great test, and we did it in Southern California, a little bit north of Los Angeles, where there's terrific winding roads. But we also found out a few things about that in that test about the NSX. And one was that the NSX was a bit of a tail-happy car. But there was one particular corner where we saw just how tail-happy it could be if you did the wrong thing, and we ended up crashing the NSX. We were just north of Ojai, and we were on a winding road. There was a long, probably 180-degree right-hander, and it was going around a mountain, so you couldn't see around the road. It wasn't super fast, maybe 50 to 60 miles an hour. But right in the middle of the corner, there was a slight rise right at the apex. And after the apex, the corner tightened up at the same time the ground dropped away. So right when you needed a little more traction, you actually lost a little bit of traction. Well, the lead car was the 911 with all-wheel drive. It tracked right through. The second car was the Acura NSX, and the editor driving that car, who will go nameless, I think lifted off the gas right when he felt the car going a little wide, and it came around, did a complete 180, and backed off the inside of the corner into the side of the cliff and really smushed the rear corner of the car badly. The third car in line, by the way, was the Lotus Esprit Turbo. It went wide. It didn't get tail happy, but he couldn't make it around the corner and went all the way across the oncoming lane and briefly touched the shoulder on the far side before he regained enough traction. He didn't crash. And I was number 4 watching all of this stuff, at one point having my windshield covered with a cloud of dust from the Esprit Turbo going off into the dust. I was in the ZR1. ZR1 was fine. I just momentarily lifted. I think I crossed the center line by a foot, and but the car didn't get out of shape at all. But the NSX was quite damaged by hitting the cliff inside, and it really demonstrated that this was an expert's car. But what this crash demonstrated was that the NSX was a very neutral car. And if you were anywhere near the cornering limit and you eased off the gas, the tail was going to come out. And on a racetrack where you knew the corner, this was great because it allowed you to balance the car just perfectly. But on a public road where there's a little bit of uncertainty, you don't necessarily know what's around the corner, or even if you know the corner, you don't know if there's someone slower in the middle of the road as you get around it. This is a touchy characteristic, and in that way the NSX was a little bit like an early 911 from the 70s. And you basically did not want to lift off when you were cornering hard, or if you lifted off, you instantly had to counter steer in order to catch the slide, otherwise you were going to spin. Despite the crash, the NSX won that first comparison test. But as the years went on, other cars started catching up with NSX in a lot of ways. And of course, we kept on doing comparison tests with it. And the next one was in July 1995. It was in this issue, Supercar Shootout, and we actually called the story the Supercar Olympics. And here again, we had the somewhat later NSX, this time compared with a Porsche 911 Turbo, a Dodge Viper, a Lotus Esprit S4S, and a Ferrari F355. The NSX really wasn't hugely improved compared with the earlier story, but a lot of these other cars were much more potent than they were before, and the NSX had a much tougher time competing against it. Back in the earlier comparison test, the NSX wasn't the fastest car, but it was in the hunt with the rest of them. By 1995, the NSX was way down on power compared to a lot of these other competitors. The one thing it had in common with this group and the earlier one was that we managed to crash an NSX again. This test was conducted in Central Ohio. And as you guys probably know, Car and Driver is headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we just don't have the type of winding roads we need for this type of comparison test in Michigan. So we went down to Central Ohio to conduct this test. Southeast of Columbus, there's an area called the Hocking Hills, and it has great roads, and you can proceed south of there or east of there, and there's a lot of other good roads too. We managed to get through all the evaluations without crashing the car, but of course, Car and Driver has pictures in it. And the pictures often show a car cornering hard. And so we'll have a photographer in the middle of this test who'll see a corner that he likes, that he thinks is photogenic, and he'll set up his camera and say, okay, you guys, I want you to come through here and show me what the car will do. We've been doing this routinely on a lot of tests, and my technique has always been, knowing that we're probably going to do 3, 4, 5 passes through there, the first time I go through there briskly, but conservatively. I don't want to crash the car. And since I'm going through here 4 or 5 times, I can go through a little faster the second time, even faster the third time, and progressively get to the point where maybe I get the tail out and run it hard. But I don't want to crash the car, and often the photographer is in a precarious position on the outside of the corner. I don't want to take him out either. Well, one of our writers, apparently, Ian is a very experienced writer, but apparently forgot this dictum and went into the corner very hard with his first pass. And here again, I can just imagine what happened. He went in hard, he realized he's going in too hard, he lifts off, and the NSX's tail came out. And this time there wasn't a lot of room on the outside, so as soon as the tail got into the marbles, that was it. He went off, hit the ditch, Didn't destroy the car, but again, put a really big dent in it. And I think he broke the rear suspension. So end of NSX for that story. And again, reinforcing the fact that the NSX, even on, I think it had the larger tires back in that comparison test, still was a fundamentally very neutral car when you pushed it hard. So if you don't take anything else away from these stories, keep that in mind and keep your really hard driving for the NSX confined to the racetrack unless you know your car very, very well. Take it easy, guys.